Jasmine Carter leaned back in her seat as the plane descended toward Denver International Airport. After 3 months of living undercover, infiltrating an international crime ring, she was exhausted. The mission had been successful, but it had taken a toll. Long nights, constant danger, and barely a moment to breathe. Now all she wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and sleep in her own bed. As the plane touched down, Jasmine tucked her sunglasses into her bag and stored her headphones. She was just another traveler, tall, black, and dressed in a sharp suit. Her suitcase rolled behind her with a soft squeak as she made her way through the jet bridge and into the airport terminal. There was nothing unusual about the scene. She'd traveled this route many times before. The line at passport control was long but moving, and Jasmine didn't mind the wait. As she approached the counter, she noticed a group of airport police standing nearby. Their eyes scanned the crowd, moving swiftly from person to person, but their glances lingered a moment too long on Jasmine. She didn't think much of it. She had been through this routine countless times as a federal agent. But when she reached the counter, she met the eyes of Officer John Miller. Miller was in his early 40s, his crew cut and rigid posture signaling authority. But his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, were scanning her as though she was a threat. She didn't feel any immediate danger, but there was something about the way he stared at her that put her on edge. "Where are you from?" Miller asked abruptly, his voice flat and without warmth. "Los Angeles," Jasmine replied, placing her passport on the counter with a calm demeanor. Miller glanced at the passport but didn't immediately return it. Instead, he looked at her again, his gaze a little colder this time. "Purpose of your trip?" "I'm returning from a business trip," she answered evenly. "Business?" Miller repeated, clearly skeptical. "What kind of business?" Jasmine's brow furrowed slightly. She was accustomed to answering questions like this, but the suspicion in his tone was unsettling. "That's confidential. I'm an FBI agent. I don't need to explain further." Miller didn't seem convinced. His eyes flickered as though he was trying to read her, looking for something out of place. Then, without another word, he signaled 2 officers standing nearby. The 2 men stepped forward, their presence imposing. One of them placed a hand on his gun, an unspoken threat hanging in the air. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her composure. She had been in much more dangerous situations before. "Do you have any weapons or anything illegal?" Miller asked, his voice more accusing than neutral. Jasmine felt her pulse quicken, but refused to let it show. "No, I don't. But I told you, I'm an FBI agent. You can check my credentials." Miller sneered. "Yeah, I've heard that one before. People like you always try to lie their way through." Jasmine's anger flared, but she kept it in check. She knew the drill. She knew the power dynamics at play, how her being a black woman made her a target. But she wasn't about to let that intimidate her. Before she could respond, one of the officers grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her. The sudden pressure made her wince, but she held her ground. "I warned you," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm FBI." Miller ignored her. "I've met plenty of imposters before," he muttered, shoving her to the ground. The weight of one officer's knee pressed into her back, pinning her to the cold, hard floor. Jasmine gritted her teeth as the pain shot through her body, but she didn't give in. "I told you," she growled again. "Call headquarters. They'll verify who I am." But Miller wasn't listening. He simply sneered down at her. "Shut up and follow orders," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Jasmine felt the heat of humiliation burn in her chest. This wasn't just about her. It was about every black person who had ever been wrongly accused, treated like a criminal, or silenced because of the color of their skin. She could hear the murmur of the crowd around her, passengers pulling out their phones to record the scene, some murmuring in disbelief. From the crowd, a voice spoke up. "I know her. She worked on the New York terrorist attack last year." "She's FBI." Jasmine's eyes narrowed. The recognition should have been enough to clear up the entire situation, but Miller remained unmoved. He didn't acknowledge the witness, didn't even look in their direction. The officer's knee dug deeper into Jasmine's back, and she struggled to take a full breath. She could feel the growing tension in the air, not just in her body, but in the crowd watching this unfold. Jasmine's mind raced, her pulse hammering in her ears. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a reminder of the constant battle she fought against injustice, one she couldn't escape, not even in her own country. Jasmine's heart raced as she lay on the cold floor, the weight of the officer's knee pressing down on her back. She could feel the roughness of the airport's tiled floor against her skin, her breath shallow as she fought to remain calm. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had done everything right, identified herself as an FBI agent, given them the correct information. But none of that mattered. To Officer Miller, she was just another target, another black woman to be mistreated and controlled. She could hear murmurs in the crowd around her, the sound of phones being pulled out and cameras clicking. Some passengers were filming, while others just stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Jasmine's mind raced. She knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It had escalated into something far worse. She wasn't being detained for any legitimate reason. She wasn't a threat. But in Miller's eyes, none of that mattered. All he saw was a black woman who dared to challenge his authority. "Get up!" Miller ordered, his voice cold and mocking. Jasmine didn't move. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her react to his taunts. She had to stay calm, stay controlled. Her FBI training kicked in. She had been through high-stakes situations before, facing down dangerous criminals and terrorists, but never like this. Not in a public airport, not with her own colleagues and fellow officers turning a blind eye to the abuse. "Do you think I'm stupid?" Miller sneered, leaning down to get a closer look at her face. "A black woman claiming to be an FBI agent without a badge? I've seen this trick before." Jasmine felt the sting of his words, the accusation in his voice like a slap. She had never been more aware of the color of her skin than she was in that moment. This wasn't about her being an agent or the work she had done for the FBI. It was about the prejudice that Miller couldn't hide, the belief that a black woman like her didn't belong in a place of authority. One of the officers behind her pulled out a set of handcuffs, clicking them tightly around Jasmine's wrists. The cold metal bit into her skin, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let them see her break. Her mind flashed to all the times she had faced this kind of treatment. How many other black people had been falsely accused, mistreated, or worse, just for the color of their skin. But this time, she wasn't going to be silent. She wasn't going to let it happen to her without a fight. "Please call headquarters," Jasmine said, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling up inside. "Verify my identity. You're making a mistake." Miller's response was a harsh laugh. "I don't need to call anyone. You're just another criminal trying to get away with it." Jasmine's eyes narrowed. She knew how this was going to go. She had been in enough tight situations to recognize when things were spiraling out of control. She had to stay calm, but it was getting harder by the second. The officers continued to hold her down, making it harder for her to breathe, while the passengers looked on, some recording, some talking among themselves. But nobody was stepping in to help. "What's going on here?" a voice interrupted. It was a woman's voice, clear and firm. Jasmine's eyes shifted to see an older woman standing in the crowd, her hands on her hips as she watched the scene unfold. "Let her go!" the woman shouted, pointing at Jasmine. "This is wrong." Miller glanced at her briefly but didn't respond. His attention remained fixed on Jasmine, still kneeling on the ground. "We're just doing our job," he said dismissively, a smirk creeping across his face. "Doing your job?" the woman shot back. "You're abusing your power. She's clearly not a threat. Let her go." Jasmine's mind raced. This was the moment. If she didn't do something, if she didn't find a way out of this, it would continue. This wouldn't just be about her, it would be about the systemic problem in law enforcement that allowed this to happen. But how could she fight back when the system itself was the one doing the wrong? The officer on her back pushed harder, and Jasmine's breath came in short bursts. But she held on to the only thing she could control, her resolve. She wasn't going to let this injustice define her. She had been through too much to be broken now. "You're making a mistake," Jasmine said one last time, her voice colder now, filled with a quiet fury that couldn't be ignored. "You'll regret this." Miller finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "We'll see about that." Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest as she was dragged away from the passport control area. The cuffs dug into her wrists, but she didn't say a word. She was escorted down a narrow hallway by two officers. the harsh fluorescent lights above casting an eerie glow on the walls. Her mind raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. This wasn't over. The truth would come out. The FBI would back her up. This would be resolved. But even as she thought that, the weight of the situation settled in. She had been unjustly detained, humiliated in front of dozens of people, and she was still being treated like a criminal. Jasmine knew how the system worked. She knew the challenges of being Black in a world that often saw her as less than. But she also knew how powerful the truth was. She had no doubt her identity would be verified. It was just a matter of time. In the small room where they had taken her, Jasmine was seated in a cold metal chair, her wrists still bound behind her. She stared at the security camera mounted in the corner of the room, knowing that the footage would soon be reviewed. But that didn't make the injustice she'd faced any easier to bear. Her mind flashed back to the moment in the airport when Miller had ignored her, when she had tried repeatedly to explain who she was. His disbelief wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of the prejudice that still ran deep in the system. She wasn't just a woman in handcuffs. She was a Black woman who had been presumed guilty because of the color of her skin. Jasmine's thoughts were interrupted by the door swinging open. Ethan Reynolds, an FBI supervisor, stepped into the room. His eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of her, handcuffed, seated in a small room, far from the powerful agent she was trained to be. "Jasmine," he said, his voice low but filled with concern. "Are you all right?" Jasmine nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I will be, but we both know this isn't just about me." Ethan gave her a sharp look. "I know, and we're going to get this sorted, but right now we need to focus on getting you out of here." Before Jasmine could respond, the door opened again, and Miller entered the room, flanked by two officers. He looked at Jasmine with a mixture of smugness and irritation, as if he were doing her a favor by even acknowledging her presence. "You think you can just walk around here impersonating an FBI agent?" Miller sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "You think the rules don't apply to you?" Jasmine's eyes locked onto his, the fire in her gaze unwavering. "I don't think. I know. And you're the one who broke the rules today, not me." Miller's face tightened. "You're lucky the FBI is even here. You think you can make a scene and just walk away without consequences? I've seen your kind before." Jasmine clenched her fists, the anger rising in her chest. She wanted to shout, to lash out at him, but she couldn't. She had to stay composed. She had to be the bigger person. "Just verify my identity," Jasmine said, her voice measured. "You'll see I'm not lying. You'll see how wrong you were." Miller didn't respond, but his eyes flickered with something Jasmine couldn't quite place. Was it guilt or was it just fear? Fear of being caught in a lie. The tension in the room was palpable as Miller stood there, silent. The minutes stretched on like hours before he finally nodded to one of the officers, signaling them to make a call. Jasmine knew it was only a matter of time before the FBI would confirm her identity, and this nightmare would end. But that didn't mean it was over. Far from it. This was just the beginning. As Miller stepped out of the room, leaving Jasmine with Ethan, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The anger that had bubbled beneath the surface was still there, but Jasmine had learned long ago to control her emotions in moments like this. She had seen too much, fought too hard, to let something like this defeat her. "We'll take care of it from here," Ethan said, his voice calm. "But Jasmine, this isn't just going to go away quietly. You'll need to speak out." Jasmine nodded, her gaze steady. "I will, but not just for me, for everyone who's been treated like this. This isn't just an isolated incident. This is systemic." Ethan's eyes softened with understanding. "We're with you. Let's make sure this doesn't happen again." The door opened and an officer stepped in, this time with a phone in hand. Jasmine could hear the voice on the other end of the line. Someone from the FBI headquarters confirming her identity. It was over. Jasmine was no longer being detained. But as she walked out of the room, free at last, she knew that the fight for justice had only just begun. The aftermath of Jasmine's wrongful arrest spread quickly. News outlets picked up the story, and soon the footage of her being tackled to the ground, handcuffed and humiliated went viral. Social media exploded with outrage, and the hashtag number Justice for Jasmine started trending. Videos from passengers at Denver International Airport flooded Twitter and Facebook, each clip a reminder of the blatant racial injustice that had just occurred. Jasmine sat in a conference room at FBI headquarters the next morning, her gaze focused on the TV screen where news anchors were covering the incident. The footage of her being pinned to the ground by airport police officers had sparked heated discussions. The media coverage was intense, with some voices defending Jasmine, while others focused on questioning the credibility of the footage, trying to downplay the clear injustice. Ethan Reynolds, who had helped secure her release, sat across from her, his expression a mix of concern and anger. "Jasmine, this is bigger than we thought. We're getting pressure from all sides and the public wants answers." Jasmine nodded. "I know, but we can't just sweep this under the rug. This isn't just about me. This is about the entire system. I want to make sure this doesn't happen again, not just to me, but to anyone else." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the table as he processed the situation. "You're right, but we have to be strategic here. If we go too hard, we risk losing the support of the public. If we go too soft, we'll be letting them off the hook." Jasmine didn't hesitate. "I'm not backing down. I've seen too many cases like this. Too many Black people subjected to abuse just because of the color of their skin. This isn't a strategy game, Ethan. This is real." The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Ethan answered it quickly, his eyes narrowing as he listened. Jasmine could tell from his expression that things were escalating fast. "They're calling for an internal investigation," Ethan said, hanging up the phone. "The Justice Department is getting involved, and the pressure is coming from all sides now. They want answers, and they want them fast." Jasmine sat up straighter. "Good. Let's make sure they get all the answers. They need to understand how deep this goes." Later that afternoon, a press conference was called. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as they awaited Jasmine's statement. She stood behind the podium, her back straight and her expression resolute. She knew the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about clearing her name. This was about shining a light on the systemic issues that allowed officers like Miller to abuse their power without consequence. The room quieted as Jasmine began to speak. "I am FBI Special Agent Jasmine Carter. What happened to me at Denver International Airport should never have happened to anyone, but it did. And I am not the first, and I will not be the last. The way I was treated, the way I was arrested without cause, without verification, simply because of the color of my skin. This is not an isolated incident." She paused, letting her words sink in. The reporters shifted in their seats, some of them typing notes furiously, others watching her closely. "This is a systemic issue," Jasmine continued. "I am speaking out today, not just for myself, but for all the people who have been unjustly accused, treated as criminals, or worse, by law enforcement, simply because of who they are, where they come from, or what they look like. This cannot continue. We cannot continue to ignore the reality of racial profiling and police brutality." The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Jasmine's eyes scanned the crowd, and she could see the mix of expressions on the faces of the reporters. Some were nodding in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. But Jasmine didn't look away. She had to keep going. "I've been in situations where my life was on the line," she said, her voice steady. "I've faced terrorists, criminals, and people who would have killed me without a second thought. But nothing has been as dangerous as what I faced when I was arrested by a police officer simply because of my race. This is a threat to all of us." A hand shot up from the front of the room. "Agent Carter, do you believe this was a case of racial profiling?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "Yes, it absolutely was. And I'm not the only one who has been through this. There are countless others who have been treated this way, but their stories go unheard, until now." As she spoke, Jasmine could feel the eyes of the world on her. The weight of the situation was enormous, but it also gave her a sense of power, a power that came from truth, from speaking out. She wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for everyone who had ever been unjustly treated by the system. "I will not stop fighting for justice," Jasmine concluded. "This isn't just about my case. This is about holding the system accountable, ensuring that those in positions of power cannot use their badges to harm others. We will continue this fight, and we will not stop until justice is served." The room erupted into questions, reporters clamoring to get their next question in. But Jasmine stood tall, her resolve unwavering. This was just the beginning. The weeks following Jasmine's press conference were a whirlwind. Public outrage continued to grow, and the pressure on the Denver Police Department was palpable. Jasmine's name became synonymous with a fight against systemic racism, her story shared across social media and news platforms. Yet, despite the overwhelming support, the road ahead was far from easy. Jasmine was called into a series of meetings with senior FBI officials and legal advisors. The investigation into Officer Miller's actions was underway, but Jasmine knew that this wasn't just about one rogue officer. It was about an entire system that had allowed him to act with impunity. The issue wasn't just Miller, it was the culture that permitted such behavior to thrive in law enforcement. She wasn't going to let that slip through the cracks. "I don't want this to be swept under the rug," Jasmine said firmly during one meeting with her superiors. "This is about more than just an internal investigation. We need real reform." Ethan Reynolds, standing beside her, nodded in agreement. "The public is watching, and they want answers. We can't ignore the bigger picture." The pressure was mounting, but it wasn't just from the public. It was also from civil rights groups, activists, and the families of those who had suffered similar abuse. Their voices had become part of the larger conversation, and Jasmine was determined to amplify them. A few days later, the Department of Justice announced they would be investigating the actions of Officer Miller and other officers involved in her wrongful arrest. The national conversation about police misconduct grew louder. The investigation also led to a broader review of police practices across Denver, with a particular focus on racial profiling and excessive use of force. Jasmine attended several panel discussions and was even invited to testify before a Senate committee on police reform. It was an exhausting but rewarding experience. She was no longer just an agent. She had become a voice for change. The platform she had found herself on was one she couldn't ignore, not when so many people had suffered in silence for so long. One afternoon, after returning from a meeting with activists, Jasmine sat down at her desk. Ethan entered her office, his face a mix of exhaustion and respect. "You've done more in the last few weeks than most people could in a lifetime," Ethan said, setting down a folder on her desk. "But this isn't over. Miller's been fired and there's more work to be done. Are you ready for that?" Jasmine's expression softened as she took a deep breath. "I'll never be done until this stops happening. Not just to me, but to every person who's ever been treated like I was. This fight is bigger than any one person." Ethan nodded, a small but meaningful smile crossing his face. "Then I'll be right there beside you. We'll make sure this isn't forgotten." In the days that followed, the investigation into Miller's actions culminated in his firing from the Denver Police Department. The Justice Department also launched a broader inquiry into racial profiling within local law enforcement. The momentum for police reform continued to grow, and public support for Jasmine remained unwavering. As the months passed, Jasmine continued her advocacy, meeting with lawmakers, speaking at rallies, and using every opportunity to push for change. But even as the story of her wrongful arrest began to fade from the headlines, she knew that the work had just begun. The road to justice was long, and there was still much to be done. One day, Ethan visited Jasmine in her office, a stack of papers in hand. "You've become a symbol, Jasmine. Your fight has opened so many doors for real change. But the real work is ahead of us." Jasmine smiled, looking out of her office window. The city below seemed to pulse with life, and she knew this was just one step in a much larger movement. "Let's keep moving forward," she said. "We'll make sure justice is served." The battle wasn't over, but Jasmine had taken a stand, and her journey was just beginning.